So the fourth criteria we want to look at is bias. And the question of bias is the question of from what perspective does the source approach its subject? So in other words, where is this writer or journalist coming from as they cover this material? And I will tell you that for our Chicano Park assignment for this street art project, it's kind of hard to find critical voices. There really aren't folks out there saying Chicano Park sucks, the art's terrible. In general, scholars and the public find Chicano Park to be a pretty amazing place. However, there are anti-immigrant Americans and Californians who would view the park and some of the claims it makes about immigration and Chicanismo with some skepticism. And I can tell you up front, those people do not appear in this street art project's works cited list. And they don't appear really in the sources used here, which just goes to point that sometimes there are positive biases. And it's very difficult to put together a work of research or scholarship that has no bias. So it's not so much that we're looking for works that have no bias. What we're trying to do as researchers is to clearly identify the biases of our sources. And when a source works to contextualize that bias by connecting us to other voices and other perspectives, to single that source out for its excellence. Because that is the strongest source, a source that has its own perspectives and opinions, but frames those in a larger discussion of other people's opinions and sources that come from different perspectives. So those are the best kind of sources, and when a source deals with bias in that way of contextualizing, it's something we should celebrate. But many sources don't, and that doesn't mean we can't use them. It just means we have to tell our readers, here's where the bias is. So we're going to see that pattern quickly emerge as we go back to look at our street art, Chicano street art example. So when we look, for example, at the database source, it has a pro-Chicano movement bias. And my job as a researcher is not to say it doesn't or pretend that it's balanced, but to point out what that bias is. Although in this case, at least there's some broader research in a works cited or a bibliography that helps us contextualize or frame that perspective or bias. Here's another site that has a pro-Chicano bias, but again, contextualized in some ways by its situation in a research university. So that we're not just getting random opinionated observations, we're getting really carefully organized field work and resources that can help people with any perspective on the park interpret or understand it. So in that sense, this resource does some better work in terms of the bias front. The Chicano Park Map and Restoration Project source, this is a completely biased source. It's a website created by Chicanos from Barrio Logan who love their community and love their park and feel strongly about their Chicano identity. And so there's no hiding the bias. That doesn't mean the source isn't incredibly useful. It just means that we need to know where it's coming from. And that's our job on the works cited. Now, it's nice to also see, though, an example of a text that really carefully works to contextualize its opinions. And this Gisela La Torre book, Walls of Empowerment, about Chicano Park and other murals in California, is clearly pro-Chicano culture. This is someone who loves this culture and is celebrating it and exploring the meaning of its art. But this researcher goes out of her way to provide exhaustive works cited and bibliographies that frame her opinion, her reading. So she says, this is what I think, but here's what other people have said and thought. And I'm putting my ideas, my perspective, ultimately my bias within that larger context so you as a reader can find out more and evaluate my own thinking. This is why academic research is so important, because it meets this highest standard of contextualizing its own perspective and bias by situating its interpretations in a larger intellectual framework. Now, once again, we want to be able to identify that when we see it, but we always want to be able to identify bias or perspective in all our sources, even when they don't attempt to frame, balance, or address it. So I hope this gives you some ideas on how to comment on the bias part of evaluating sources for your street art work cited, annotated works cited page. Thanks.